When you think of horror, especially horror in written fiction, you're probably more inclined to think of authors like Stephen King than you are to think about a fantasy author like Brandon Sanderson. But for any person who is familiar with some of Sanderson's work, you'll know that he works elements of horror into his stories and worlds with regular frequency. What's interesting is that he doesn't do it in a way that pulls his stories into grimdark territory. It should be very easy for a writer to make their fantasy story fall into the grimdark subgenre if they try to add heavy amounts of horror to their story. Sanderson, however, has found a way to incorporate horror in a way that not only leaves a lasting impression on the reader, but that also doesn't undermine his setting or style of fantasy. So how does he use horror? What methods does he employ to strike this fine-tuned balance? I'd like to explore some of these questions in this short video, and hopefully we'll learn a few things from this amazing author. But first, we must define what exactly horror is and why you would want to use horror in your story. According to Wikipedia, horror fiction is fiction with the intent to frighten, scare, or disgust the reader. It's a piece of fiction in prose of variable length which shocks or even frightens the reader, or perhaps induces a feeling of repulsion or loathing. It intends to create an eerie and frightening atmosphere for the reader, and often the central menace of a work of horror fiction can be interpreted as a metaphor for larger fears of a society. This gives a fairly solid understanding of what horror is, but be careful not to confuse horror for terror. In 1826, the Gothic novelist Anne Radcliffe published an essay distinguishing two elements of horror fiction, terror and horror. Whereas terror is a feeling of dread that takes place before an event happens, horror is a feeling of revulsion or disgust after an event has happened. Radcliffe describes terror as that which expands the soul and awakens the faculties to a high degree of life, whereas horror is described as that which freezes and nearly annihilates them. Horror isn't always something that gets the blood pumping. It's not something that makes your heart beat faster or your palms sweaty with anticipation. Rather, it's something that slowly freezes you to your core and fills your soul with dread. It's cold, menacing, and saps all feeling of life and joy from your bones. The thing about horror is that it's also not something new. It's deeply tied to the human experience, and we have records of it having ancient roots in human civilization. Again, pulling from Wikipedia, the horror genre has ancient origins, with roots in folklore and religious traditions focusing on death, the afterlife, evil, the demonic, and the principle of the thing embodied in the person. These manifested in stories of beings such as demons, witches, vampires, werewolves, and ghosts. European horror fiction became established through works of the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans. Mary Shelley's well-known 1818 novel about Frankenstein was greatly influenced by the story of Hippolytus, whom Asclepius revives from the dead. Euripides wrote plays based on the story Hippolytikos, Calyptomenos, and Hippolytus. In Plutarch's The Lives of the Noble Grecians and Romans, in the account of Cimon, the author describes the spirit of a murderer, Damon, who himself was murdered in the bathhouse of Chaeronea. Elements of the horror genre also occur in biblical texts, notably in the book of Revelation. So as you can see, horror is something that slowly freezes you to your core and saps all feeling of life and joy from your bones. But it's also something ancient and deeply rooted in the human psyche. And this is something that Brandon Sanderson taps into when he writes horror into his stories. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Before we look at how Sanderson uses it, we need to understand why you would want to use it. It's all well and good if you want to write a horror story or if you want to add horror into your fiction, but you can't do so haphazardly. Why would you actually want to use horror elements in your writing? Your reasons for using horror may be varied. Some of you may want to write a full horror story. Others might just want to have horror elements in the story. And some might want to write a blend between horror and another genre. Whatever your reasons for using horror, you need to know your why. Adding it for nothing more than a bit of variety will just cause you to overplay it or do it half-heartedly. You need a proper why. So why do you want to use horror? It doesn't have to be a super deep reason. Maybe you're writing a fantasy story and you want it to be a darker, less understood side of the world and magic to juxtapose what the reader will be seeing most of the time. Maybe you want something truly intimidating and scary for your character to face off against. Or perhaps you want something that merely adds to the overall atmosphere of the story and setting. All of these are valid reasons, but you must do so with intent. You must have a reason why you want to use the horror, because it is in understanding why that you begin to understand when. Once you know why you want to use horror, then you'll know when to use it. Using our previous examples, if you want to use horror as a break of tone from the normal setting and magic that the reader sees, you'll know to use it sparingly and when the reader gets that rare glimpse into the other side. If you want something scary and intimidating for your characters to face off against, you'll use it in tense scenes where there's a lot at stake and in the build-up to those scenes. If you want something to add to the overall atmosphere of the story and setting, you'll pepper it in when you need to remind the reader that this is a dark world that is both dangerous and frightening. There is, unfortunately, no exact formula for when you should use horror in your story. If, however, you do decide to include it, you should first deeply understand why that is. If you can answer the question of why you want horror elements in your story, only then will you know when to do it. The why will inform the when. And once you have the answer to both of these questions, then you'll be ready to start looking at how it's done in order to start doing it yourself. So if you have your why and your when ready, let's look at the how. Let's look at Brandon Sanderson's work and see just how he tackles horror in his writing. Now, before we get into some examples from Sanderson's works, I want to throw up a bit of a disclaimer. We will be going into some examples from works like Mistborn, the Stormlight Archive, Warbreaker, Elantris, and one of his short stories called Shadows for Silence in the Forests of Hell. In none of these will I be touching on any plot points or elements about a character or their actions. So while I am revealing things about the setting, magic system, or some other force in the narrative, I will not be spoiling anything of relevance. So, to start with some of the less obvious examples, Elantris and Warbreaker both use traditionally horror-like or dark fantasy elements in them. What's crazy is that Sanderson writes these books in a way that neither actually feel very much like it has horror elements. Warbreaker basically has widespread necromancy, but covers it in a veneer of colorful magic and societal acceptance. Elantris essentially has the magical equivalent of zombies in a post-apocalyptic city. It doesn't exactly feel like this, however, because of the way that Sanderson presents it to you through the eyes of the characters. In both of these examples, horror elements were used to enrich the world, but were presented in a way so as not to seem like straight-up horror, unless you look beneath the surface-level depictions. In Mistborn and Shadows for Silence in the Forests of Hell, Sanderson makes the horror elements more obvious and in your face, but works it into the setting of the world, rather than making it a hidden or darker side of the narrative. Mistborn has the mists which slowly begin to act in a truly horrifying way. Combine that with a constant cloudy sky, the ash falls, and the terrifying creatures that inhabit the world of Scadrial, and you're left with a setting truly fit for horror. Shadows for Silence in the Forest of Hell does something similar. It's the setting that adds all the horror to the story. The eerie forests, the shades that roam the landscape, the deathly effects of breaking the rules. All of these elements come together to create a setting that feels very much like the setting of a horror story. In both of these examples, the horror elements were worked into the setting of the world without making the world seem like a grimdark fantasy. And finally, we have the Stormlight Archive. Stormlight is unique in that Sanderson doesn't make the setting a horrific one, nor does he really try and use horror elements in a non-obvious way. What he does, however, is go full eldritch horror. Without going into spoilers, there are gigantic, ancient, twisted creatures that roam the planet of Roshar and affect its inhabitants. These creatures differ in how they manifest and in how they affect the world. Some send people into a bloodlust frenzy, some create Tar-like clones of people to fight with, while others make people go mad with carnal pleasures. There are other horror elements in the Stormlight Archive, but these are the ones that strike me the most. I find it truly impressive how Sanderson managed to fit eldritch horror into an epic fantasy story without making it seem strange or contrived. This example exemplifies how Sanderson took a cosmic psychological horror element and made it fit into the world building of the story he's trying to tell. And now that we've covered some ways that Brandon Sanderson uses horror in his stories, I'd like to focus on some key lessons we can take away from his methods. How can we use Sanderson's methods to inform our own use of horror in a better way? Before we conclude the video, I'd just like to briefly go over 3 key takeaways I have from looking into Sanderson's use of horror in his fiction. Number 1, horror doesn't have to be horrific. The first lesson is that you don't always have to use horror elements in a scary or horrific way. If you have elements from horror that you want to use, but don't want to affect the theme or tone of your story, then you can proceed without a worry. Whether it's magical zombies or rampant necromancy, there can be horror elements in your story without making your story scary or horrific. Number 2, horror can inform setting. If, on the other hand, you want the horror elements to affect the thematic feel of your story without making the actual narrative a horror story, you can always have horror inform your setting. Sanderson chose to use mist, strange creatures, and dark shadows for his settings, but you can always use other horror elements to make your setting seem more horrific than the reader may expect. And third, world building facilitates horror. If you want to fit horror elements into your story without making it seem forced or out of place, then world building is your friend. The only way that Sanderson was able to make his eldritch horrors fit into the story of the Stormlight Archive was to build a world where it made sense for these creatures to exist. You can achieve the same effect if you focus on making the horror elements work within the rules you've defined for your world. There are many ways that you can make horror work with your stories. Some are easier than others and some are more straightforward than others. Whichever direction you choose to take, I hope that this video has helped you in some way. Thank you very much for watching. I sincerely appreciate all your time and attention. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like, since that's one of the biggest metrics that YouTube looks at when recommending it. And if you'd like to see more, please hit that subscribe button so that you can be notified of future videos. Take care, and we'll talk again very soon.